You're listening to another episode of Paleo Runner Podcast, a podcast devoted to finding better ways to live, run, train, and eat. I'm your host, Aaron Olson. You can find out more information by going to paleorunner.org. If you enjoy the show, please go to iTunes and leave a review. This helps increase the visibility of the show in iTunes. Search for Paleo Runner in iTunes and click on Ratings and Reviews. You can email feedback to aaron@paleorunner.org. If you downloaded this through iTunes and are listening on an Apple device, you can follow along with links and chapters. Today's guest is Matt Fitzgerald. Thanks for listening.
Matt Fitzgerald is a prolific endurance sports journalist and author of many books on running, triathlon, fitness, nutrition, and weight loss. Matt is also a competitor himself and has run numerous marathons and shorter distances and an Ironman triathlon. Matt, thanks so much for being part of the show. It's great to have you on.
Great to be with you, Aaron.
So, Matt, I can tell from reading your books that you're really passionate about the sport of running and endurance sports, and it really shows in your running. Your books are very interesting to read. How did you become interested in running?
I became interested in running through my dad, actually. He was part of the first big running boom in the late 70s and early 80s. He ran his first marathon in 1983. It was the Boston Marathon. Of course, you might ask, how could Boston be his first marathon since you have to qualify for that? Well, back in those days, actually, more than half the people who ran Boston every year were bandits. It was very, very different race. So my dad ran it as a bandit at the back with thousands of others. And our whole family, I have two brothers, and we all packed up a car and went down to watch him. So we just, navigated our way around to various points of the course. And then our last viewing spot was somewhere between a mile and a half from the finish line. And my two brothers and I actually ran that last stretch of the race with him and crossed the finish line with him. And it was just, as you might be able to imagine, just a magical experience. And the very next day, I announced at the breakfast table that I was going to start running too, and I made good on that. So I was 11 years old, about to turn 12 at the time, and I got hooked.
Nice. So when did you end up running your first marathon then?
Well, it took a while to get around to it. I really got into the running in middle school and high school. But then at the end of high school, I actually burned out on it and stopped. Just quit the sport cold turkey. I had intended to run in college, had largely picked my college because of its running program, but then ended up just not running there, and only got back into it in my mid-20s. After I just happened to get a job with an endurance sports magazine. At the time, I was kind of fat, out of shape, over 200 pounds, but being in that environment kind of it reignited the old flame, and I slowly worked my way back into shape, and then eventually ran my first marathon. I would have been 28.
Okay. You mentioned that you were over 200 pounds. From looking at your picture online, I could never imagine that. How tall are you?
I'm 6'1".
Okay.
I weigh. I'm naturally a skinny guy. When I first reached my adult height in high school, I weighed 138 pounds at 6'1". So I was pretty much the skinniest guy I knew. But both my parents have to work hard to stay slim. So I guess there was something in the genes, and when I stopped running at the end of high school, I gained weight very quickly. It wasn't all fat. I got into weightlifting and put on a lot of muscle.
Okay.
Too. I tell people I sort of look like one of those 1980s pro wrestlers with big muscles and a big gut.
Okay. One of the things I'd like to talk to you about today is your books that involve this idea of brain training. How did you come up with this idea, and what exactly is it?
Yeah, there's a family connection there as well. My older brother, Josh, he, after graduating from college, entered a PhD program in cognitive neuroscience, or computational neuroscience, actually. So he was studying the brain, and when we would catch up on the phone every now and then, he would tell me about all the stuff he was learning, and I thought it was just really fascinating. I mean, the human brain is just kind of one of these last frontiers of science, and it's about who we are. So I think anyone would kind of have an intrinsic interest in it. And he was very good at sort of dumbing things down so I could understand them, and he recommended popular science books about the brain to read, and so I did that, and I just thought it was interesting, but didn't think it was anything I would ever really apply, except that as I got into my career as an endurance sports journalist, I started to notice that for the first time, exercise scientists were also paying attention to the brain. New brain imaging techniques and stuff had come along that made it possible to account for the brain's role in exercise performance. So then I thought, well, this is cool because, you've got these scientists working on that stuff, but it isn't really penetrating to, the actual running market yet. So I thought, since I have a bit of a head start on this, I might be able to be a bridge between, the brain science and the practical applications for runners and other endurance athletes. So I started to just spend a lot of time thinking through, the stuff that we're learning about the brain and exercise. Is it just interesting, or does it make a difference? Should we tweak how we approach the sport? And, I decided, this stuff wasn't going to call for a wholesale, revision of training methods and such, but that it did call for kind of a new perspective on how athletes approach training and even, the psychology of the sport. So, that started maybe around 2001, 2002 for me, and I've been at it ever since.
You mentioned that you started learning more about the role that the brain is playing in exercise and fatigue, and how is that different from traditional methods that were written about prior to your book?
Yeah, so the idea, and we should have known this all along, is that your brain is really responsible for absolutely everything that happens. When you're running, it initiates muscle contractions. The very idea to run comes from your brain. The control of the fuel sources that your muscles use, that regulated by the brain. It's not just automatically happening. Your brain decides. Even your respiration rate, the way your breathing is synchronized with your foot strikes, that is controlled by the brain. So lots of unconscious stuff, but also you get into the psychological elements, the perception of effort, regulation of pace, which is largely done by feel, resisting fatigue, and even your brain appears to enforce fatigue when you get tired. Tim Noakes, the exercise scientist at the University of Cape Town, South Africa, who has a lot of interest in the brain, he says the feeling of fatigue is fatigue. So you name it, anything that's going on when you're running, your brain is governing it somehow. And even we now know that the brain adapts to regular exercise training both faster and more profoundly than any other organ of the body. So you can imagine that given all that stuff that we've learned, it does call for it's just very different from the old models, which really scientists have a way of just ignoring anything they can't measure. And because from the time exercise science was born as a discipline, around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century up until maybe the 1990s, they couldn't measure the brains. They just ignored it, so they didn't include it in any of their models of exercise performance. We now know that at the point of exhaustion during endurance exercise, when you bonk, there is reserve physical capacity in the body when that happens. You bonk because simply you cannot take the pain anymore. It's a voluntary thing. Well, that's a new and profound insight that we didn't have before. The old models all assume that there was some kind of catastrophic breakdown, purely physical breakdown from the neck down somewhere in the body, and that caused fatigue. So those are the kinds of differences that we're talking about in the models, which have practical ramifications.
A lot of I know I just read Rich Rowe's latest book, and he talks about going in and getting his physiology tested out, like lactate threshold and heart rate and things like that, so that he can set up all his training paces. Are those things now, because of this brain-centered approach to fatigue, are those things irrelevant, or are those still important?
Still very, very important. I mean, the thing to understand is that fatigue is always mediated through conscious perception. So, if you're running in a marathon and you get to mile 22 and you just hit the wall, and you slow down, and it feels inexorable, that it feels like I'm still trying to run as fast as I was before, but I just can't. Okay, well, that's actually not true. You have the capacity to keep running at the pace you were before. You just can't take the pain, and so you're slowing down. That doesn't mean that our physical capabilities are actually unlimited, that we're all Superman, but we just, because we encounter our mental limits before we ever reach our ultimate physical limits, that if only we could get these mental limits out of the way, every one of us could run a 2-hour marathon or whatever. That's not the case at all, because your perception of effort and suffering and fatigue and all that stuff is closely linked to your physical capacities. So when you train to get to increase your physical capacities, well, that modifies the relationship between those capacities and your perception of effort. So suddenly, after 12 weeks of training, whereas, say, at the start of that process, an 8-minute mile felt moderately hard. Well, after 12 weeks, an 8-minute mile feels much easier because because of that modified relationship between your body's physical capacities. So it's still largely, it's largely about, you really want to focus on your muscles and your oxygen carrying capacity and all this stuff, because it's going to allow you to run faster and farther and before you reach the point where you can't take the pain anymore.
What's been your reception from coaches and athletes as far as taking this into account, this idea that the brain has a governor on it, and it's going to let you run, say, 90% of your max or your reserve, and it's not going to let you hit that 100%, because at that 100% you're going to break down, so it's going to set a lower limit. That's kind of the idea, right?
Yeah, that is the way Tim Noakes' central governor model. That's sort of the language of his model.
Okay.
There's there are sort of other ways of framing it. There's another researcher out there named Samuela Marcora, who I talk more about in the Mind Body Running book. He focuses less on that unconscious governor and more on what I've been emphasizing in this interview, which is conscious perceptions. For him, it's really the limits are conscious and psychological versus some kind of homunculus or little man inside your brain who's just saying, stop there, don't go anywhere. So there's slightly different ways of looking at it, but yeah, that's the basic idea, that we never actually encounter our true physical limits in endurance exercise, that we always stop short of that due to some kind of brain or psychological barrier that we hit first. Yeah, so to answer your question, it's actually been extremely gratifying that coaches whom I respect and high-level runners have been very, very receptive to this concept, because it really, the thing I hear over and over again is that, especially people who read the Mind Body Running book, they'll tell me, I always felt that way, but I just never had the words to articulate it, and so there's not a lot of resistance. I mean, endurance athletes like to think of themselves as being mentally tough, and they don't necessarily like the idea that they quit. That they say, well, other people may slow down because they can't take the pain, but I actually go to my true physical limits. So there's some pushback against that. Unfortunately, the experiments that prove that it's really more of a mental thing than a physical one are incontrovertible. I mean, this is just an established fact. But in terms of just all the rest of it, people have been very receptive to these ideas.
Yeah, I know Dathan Ritzenheim wrote the foreword to your book Run, and that was really interesting to see his perspective on how he used some of the ideas in your book towards his training. You were talking about that there is some evidence to show that this theory or this idea that the brain is really important is really the correct way of looking at it. Do you have any studies or things that you could share with me or the audience of what that evidence is?
Sure. They're really all over the place. There are lots of different ways to come at this. Kind of one very simple way to provide evidence in support of this notion is to look at the effects of certain drugs that influence endurance performance. for example, caffeine is known to be performance enhancing, but caffeine acts on the brain. All it does is it reduces perception of effort. It doesn't do anything to help your muscles. It doesn't do anything to help your body metabolize fuels better or to improve your VO2 max. It simply activates parts of your brain that are involved with perception of effort, so that your normal pace simply feels a bit easier. And so when you take caffeine and it enhances your performance, the only reason it's doing that is because the exercise feels easier. Well, that wouldn't be possible if you were already able to exercise to your ultimate physical limit. So, and there are also other drugs that do the opposite. They act on the brain. They don't act on anything but the brain, and yet they lower endurance performance. So that's one way. I wouldn't classify those things under the incontrovertible proof category. Those studies are more like the research that's being done by the guy I mentioned earlier, Samuel Marcora. He did a really interesting study involving rugby players, where he had them ride on stationary bikes, and it was a 3-part test. Initially, he had them pedal as hard as they possibly could for just 5 seconds. Then right after that, they had to sustain a fixed high but sub-maximal pedaling intensity as long as they could. So he just said, you have to sustain this wattage as long as you possibly can, and only quit when you simply cannot turn the pedal cranks one more time at that wattage. And then there was a secret third part of the test that they didn't know about, that he launched on them as soon as they quit that second part, in total exhaustion. He forced them to immediately pedal as hard as they could for 5 seconds once again. So what he was really interested in looking at was the difference in power output in those 2 5-second sprints. And the middle part, on average, these guys were able to continue pedaling for somewhere between 10 to 15 minutes. So you could think of it as like a 3K to 5K, like running race effort type of thing. So in theory, if these people were truly quitting the second part of that test because they were physically exhausted and they had reached some kind of absolute physical limit, then whatever wattage they had been sustaining in that second part of the test would be their limit for that second 5-second sprint. They couldn't, and it was an average of 242 watts. So to back up, when they pedaled all out for 5 seconds, when they were completely fresh, they were able to put out more than 1,000 watts, which is huge. But these guys were college rugby players, so you would expect that. In the second part, when they had to sustain a high sub-maximal intensity, the average was 242 watts. And on average, they quit in complete exhaustion, so they believed, after 10 or 15 minutes at that level. And then immediately afterward, again, they were forced to repeat that 5-second sprint. Well, if they were truly physically exhausted at 242 watts, then in that second 5-second sprint that they had to do immediately afterwards, they couldn't have possibly have exceeded 242 watts, right? Because they had been told to pedal as long as they possibly could at 242. If they quit, that means they can't sustain 242. But Samuel Marcora said, "You're not done yet. Sprint again for 5 seconds right now, as hard as you can." On average, they were able to put out 731 watts in that second 5-second sprint, supposedly when they were completely physically exhausted. And Marcora said the whole reason they did it is because for psychological reasons. They had quit the second part of the test simply because the pain just wasn't worth it to them anymore. They weren't going to get anything great out of this. These guys were mentally tough, athletes, but everyone's got their limits. So they quit at some point. They're just, this pain's getting to be too much. But then when they were required to sprint again, they thought, well, it's only going to be 5 seconds. And they weren't able to match their original 5-second sprint hour. So obviously there was some peripheral fatigue, as the scientists call it, some fatigue that really was not just in the brain. But 731 is 3 times as much as 242.
Right.
So clearly they had a lot left in the tank when they believed that they were truly exhausted. So if you've had people who are wedded to the old model who said, well, because they didn't start the second 5-second sprint immediately after they quit in exhaustion, I think there was like a 2 to 3 second gap, because he had to spring it on them, he had to surprise them.
Mm-hmm.
The naysayer said, oh well, they had enough time to recover in those 2 to 3 seconds gap. Well, that's a bunch of baloney. And plus, there's a lot of other studies that come at it from different angles. So research like that is the kind of stuff that really, bolsters the case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of people I think they intuitively know that the mind does have a pretty big effect on their performance. I think you mentioned a story about yourself where you were running a 5K and I think you were about to break 16 minutes. And you saw the clock, and that kind of made you thought you were exhausted, but once you saw the clock, it spurred you on to try harder.
Yeah, that whole end spurt phenomenon is that's another type of evidence that reserve capacity is always there. So yeah, and there've been lab tests to prove as well that if required to, athletes can always pick up the pace within sight of the finish, even when they've been slowing down, presumably because they couldn't help it, before then. And that's something that any runner who's done a few races knows from experience, that no matter how hard you feel that you've driven yourself, through most of the race, once you get close to the finish, you find that there's more there. It's like, wow, I could have picked it up at any point, actually. And that was a particularly interesting case because I had thought that race was really heading south on me. I had started too fast, and I was slowing down. I saw my mile splits, and then when I saw that I had a chance at PR, I was able to find all kinds of wherewithal that I didn't think had been there before.
Well, that's a pretty fast time for a 5K. What was that, your PR?
Yeah, it's funny. I've never done better than that one. It was the 15:56, and it was the end of an 80-mile week in marathon training. I remember it was like 32 degrees, and this is in San Diego. I ran it in tights and gloves and everything, and it was just I really was not expecting. But sometimes you just have those days. I just felt really good and had a good race, and I kind of assumed that I would be able to improve on that later in better circumstances, but it never happened.
Now, you talk a lot about neuromuscular recruitment and how the brain recruits muscles in the body to help propel you forward faster, and you even prescribe some jumping exercises and things like that. Can you tell the audience a little bit about what those sorts of exercises are doing and how they might help us in our running?
Yeah, so, when you're running, you can think of running as just this ongoing conversation between your brain and your muscles, and it's a two-way conversation. Your brain drives your muscles, through, a network of nerves that connect the brain to the muscles, but your brain also receives feedback from the muscles through the very same network of nerves. So there are lots of different ways that you can manipulate that conversation in order to improve as a runner. And plyometrics exercises or jumping types of exercises are one of those ways. Running is really just a controlled form of jumping. So, lots of training methods just consist of isolating one particular dimension of your sport, in this case running, and then sort of emphasizing it or exaggerating it, and then sort of when you plug that back into the complete activity, you benefit. Plyometrics specifically improves running. It doesn't. You might think that it would actually make you more powerful, and it can, but that's not how. That would be more beneficial to a sprinter. That's not how it improves distance running performance. It actually, plyometrics improves distance running performance by improving running economy. And how it does that is that every time your foot lands on the ground, your leg functions like a spring. And if it could either be kind of a looser spring or a stiffer spring, and if it's loose, you're going to have more give in the joints and in the network of connective tissue that runs throughout the muscles in your legs. And if there's more give, if that spring is looser, you'll actually lose more energy, because when you land, your leg will absorb energy from the ground, and it can actually, just like a spring, propel some of that energy right back into the ground, and it's like free energy for moving forward. So if you're able to kind of stiffen up that spring action, you can capture and reuse more free energy from the ground, and plyometrics works in that way. It actually, stiffness has kind of negative connotations when you use the word colloquially, but in physics, which is what we're really talking about, the physics of springs, stiffening up your leg is actually beneficial, because it gives you free energy, and that is how plyometrics is helpful to runners.
Okay, interesting. Now, you talked there about the stiffness of the spring. Why is it that so many runners spend a lot of time stretching? If we really want our muscles to be, kind of springy and stiff, does stretching play any role in performance improvement?
Well, it could, but you would be going after something completely different. Yeah, so conceivably, spending a lot of time stretching could make your legs functionally less stiff, when you're talking about, that role in running of capturing energy from the ground. So, yeah, that could be problematic. The proper use for stretching, and where it can actually be beneficial, is if you have particular muscles or tendons in your body that are just too tight to function normally, and that can happen. So there are some common overuse injuries in runners that are contributed to by just excessive tightness. And so if you're trying to use stretching in a targeted way to undo some of those imbalances, and then it can actually aid your performance. But you don't want to just, that idea that, if I just generally become more flexible through, just lots of stretching, that will help me. No, that's not the case at all. It's more of you have to think of it as a sort of a physical therapy type of use for stretching, where it's very targeted and just trying to allow you to have really a normal range of motion in all of the, the relevant joints.
One of the things that, as I was reading your books, you mentioned is really important is total volume of training. And at first, when I was starting out your books, I thought, okay, this is kind of a way to hack into my brain and get more from less training. But then later on, you say, actually, it's still really important to get in some volume in there. How does that relate to this idea of the brain and training and still keeping your volume up? How is that important to try to get in the most running you can, while not overdoing it?
Yeah, I mean, we know just from the last 50 years of collective trial and error in run training by the best runners all over the world. We know that a high volume approach is the most effective way to train. It's just simply running more is the simplest and most effective way to run better. So we didn't need any brain scientists to come around and tell us. In fact, if they had told us otherwise, we could have just said, "Shut up." We don't care, because we know from where it really matters in the real world that there's a reason all elite runners run 100 miles a week or more. Mm-hmm. But it turns out that, of course, what scientists who study the role of the brain in exercise performance are learning is that there is, in fact, a brain training rationale for high volume. And it comes back to that idea that whenever you're running, there's a conversation going on between your brain and your muscles. And what happens is the longer that conversation goes on, the more shortcuts and efficiencies your brain is able to find in terms of how it fires your muscles. It's not that different from juggling. Just, how does a juggler become better at juggling? He just juggles more. You know what I mean? You don't necessarily consciously modify your technique or anything. You just keep doing it and you let this kind of unconscious process happen. You're allowing your brain and your muscles to talk back and forth, and you get better at juggling. And the same thing happens. New techniques for kind of measuring how hard your brain has to work to make your body do what you want it to do when you run. And what this research has shown is that beginners, people who they don't run, but they're, for the sake of an experiment, they're slapped on a treadmill and asked to run, their brains have to work really hard because they're not used to the activity. So it's almost like when you get your driver's license and you drive a car for the first time, you're exhausted just after 10 miles to get to your friend's house because you haven't done it before, and you're kind of white-knuckling it the whole time. Your brain is just hyper-aware of every little move you're doing behind the wheel, and it's the same thing for beginning runners. And it's a little different. That's a little different from running economy or how much oxygen you have to use. It's really a brain thing. Whereas experienced runners who've been running for a while, their brains are much, much quieter when they're running at the same pace because they've just done it so many times that their brain can just be sort of on autopilot, just like, I know how to do this. And so as a result, because fatigue really does originate in the brain, an experienced runner who's just got all those miles in his body, he's just farther away from the point of fatigue because his brain is quieter. And this applies not just to running, but to any sport. I think it's in the brain training book, I mentioned research involving golfers, which shows that when golfers are putting, trying to just, stroke the ball into the hole, those who have the least activity in their brains are the most accurate putters. And what that indicates is that they're more experienced. They've practiced putting more times so that they're not, they can almost do it in their sleep. And so that to bring it full circle, that's why high volume of running is the most effective approach to training, because you're accelerating that whole process. You're giving your brain and your muscles more time together to work things out.
How have you been able to personally find a balance between not doing quite enough to get your full potential and overtraining? Because you do talk about overtraining in the book, and you say that's really doesn't have much of an advantage. How have you been able to do that?
Yeah, it's obviously volume comes with risk, especially in running. It's interesting in sports like cycling and swimming, you will see recreationally competitive athletes putting in volumes that are much closer to what the elites do. Whereas running, there's more of an injury risk that comes with increasing volume. And overtraining can be a problem too, but most runners are likely to get hurt before they actually become overtrained. In either case, the advantages that come with running more, they also come with a risk. So you have to be careful in how you approach the question of volume. And in my case, I'm a very, very injury-prone runner, and I almost, if I just think about getting injured, I'll get injured. So I have to be extremely careful, and sometimes it almost doesn't matter what I do. I've had every overuse injury you can name, most of them more than once. So one thing that has helped is just patience. Learning to take my time. I set my marathon and half marathon PRs when I was 37, and the reason I did it at that late age, even though I started running when I was 11, was that I was running a lot more, training a lot more at that age because I just couldn't do it before. I had to take my time and slowly increase the amount of running I did, with many steps back along the way. So that sort of patient, very gradual, incremental increase, because your body does get more durable. Even some elites talk about this. I remember Meb Keflezighi telling me that, when he, early in his career, when he tried to put in 120, 130-mile weeks, he just couldn't do it. He would get injured. Mm-hmm. But that, so he kind of stepped back to 100 and 110. But a few years down the road, his body had just become more durable and resilient, and he was able to put in those 120, 130-mile weeks. So that's one thing. Another thing you can do is cross-train. I do a ton of cross-training. It helps that I'm a triathlete as well, so I want to swim and bike anyway. cross training is, an hour on the bike for a runner is not the same as an hour running because your brain and muscles aren't having exactly the same conversation. But cross training can still be very beneficial. I mean, an hour on the bike is still a lot better for a runner than an hour on the couch because you're still able to work on some of those constraints, that limit how fast and how far you're able to run before you bonk. So I do a lot of cross training as well, and that can be a terrific solution for runners who are serious enough to want to put in the time to be the best they can be, but can't necessarily do it all with running the way a lot of the elites can.
Okay. So, sometimes when you start adding more volume, you start to experience diminishing returns. You're putting in a lot more time, but your times might only get a few seconds faster or something like that. What kind of improvements did you see when you started upping your volume at 37, and what were your PRs in the half marathon and marathon?
Well, yeah, there's definitely a law of diminishing returns, and it starts at a fairly low level. So, if you go from running 0 miles a week to 10 miles a week, you're just going to improve a ton. But if you go from 10 to 20, you're also going to improve a ton, but not quite as much as you did from those first 10 miles, and on you go. So the diminishing returns kick in right away, but that doesn't mean it's not worth it. You're still going to get a lot of improvement from going from, say, 40 miles a week to 50. You may have to be, a professional runner who's making his or her living off of running to decide that it's worth it to go from 110 to 120 because you're only going to get a tiny little bit of improvement. But, that's the difference between winning and losing, so it's worth it. So just because returns are diminishing doesn't mean it's not worth it. But then, there is sort of a kind of breakthrough phenomenon that will occur. And I kind of had that experience myself, and especially in the longer distance races where the wheels can come off, especially if you take the marathon where, if you have circuits that are maybe sensible based on your PRs at shorter distances, well, you can fail to achieve those predicted times, those goals in the marathon by many minutes just if you can't hold your goal pace the whole way, you're just going to fall apart. You're just going to be hemorrhaging time in the last few minutes. And that's always what happened to me. I just had, just one disastrous meltdown in the marathon after another because I was insistent. All the race prediction formulas said I could achieve a certain time. So, damn it, that's what I was going to go for. And if I couldn't do it, I would fall short, sometimes by 10, 15 minutes, because I would just be practically walking to the finish. So that year when I was 37, I was able to stay healthy, kind of build on all, the incremental progress I'd made up to that point. I got up to running some 80, 85 mile weeks, and, even did things like back-to-back 20 milers, so 20 miles on Saturday, 20 miles on Sunday, because I really was looking for a breakthrough. And I ran a half marathon. I didn't improve that a lot because that's still in that level where you're not going to probably, just completely fall apart in the last mile. But I was 37 and I set a PR by 20 seconds or something in that race. It was in the low 113s. But in the marathon, I had a really interesting experience where I got about 6 or 7 miles, and my goal was to run 2:39. I got about 6:05 per mile. So I ran that pace for the first 10K or so. But then I discovered that the course just was not as well suited to running fast as I thought it was. And I already wasn't comfortable at that pace. So I dialed it back by about 10 seconds per mile. And my thought was, okay, here we go again, because every time that had happened before, it was just the beginning of a downward spiral. So I thought, it's going to be the same thing all over again. But lo and behold, 15 miles later, I was still running the same pace. I hadn't slowed down anymore. And I just felt this, I remember it very distinctly. I just felt like this deep inner strength in my body that had never been there before. And I knew it was from just all those miles I had lost. Like, I didn't feel good, but it almost didn't even matter. Just every mile was a grind, but each one was really no worse than the mile before. So I ended up just, kind of holding that kind of 6:12 pace to the finish, and I think I was 2:41 was my finish time. So I didn't quite achieve my goal, but it was clear the lesson from that was that, mileage matters. That was a pretty powerful lesson for me personally.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that sounds like an amazing experience, and that's one of the things I really like about running is these psychological sort of breakthroughs that happen to a lot of us on especially the longer distance runs. At least for me, it kind of changes just your outlook towards life and what you think you can accomplish and how you can push through things.
I totally agree.
Another topic I'd like to get into in the last few minutes here is this paleo-style diet. This seems to be kind of a craze that's taken off lately, and it's something that I tried out, and I had always had issues with my stomach on longer runs especially, and I've talked to other runners, and they, it's kind of a common experience, but since I've gone on this paleo diet for about the last year, I haven't had any of that. And I know you're a nutritionist. What do you make of this diet and how it's taken off, and do you have any thoughts on it?
Yes, I guess my take on the paleo diet is that if you do it right, it can be a very healthy way to eat, and that's whether you're an athlete or non-athlete. And doing it right is maintaining adequate variety in your diet, maintaining very high quality standards for the foods you do eat, and especially being careful with meat. You can't just overdo the bacon or whatever. Like if you're going to go paleo, I'd recommend that you probably emphasize seafood over meat generally, and then get your grass-fed beef versus a McDonald's patty, that type of thing. So with those cautions, I think it can be a perfectly healthy way to eat, and for athletes, for runners as well, it can be a good performance diet. In that case, you want to be, in addition to the other concerns, you want to pay attention to your carbohydrate intake and make sure that it's adequate. So I guess I don't eat that way myself, and it's not a diet that I advocate as being better than other alternatives. But it's one of the options. It seems like, especially you look at the anecdotal evidence like yours, a lot of people seem to be having good results when they make that switch. So it's not for everyone, but it seems to be a viable option for many.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you have any thoughts about this idea that it's a diet that we're supposedly more biologically adapted to not eating grains? Do you think that there's any truth to that, or is that just part of the fad?
Well, to be honest, I don't see a lot of value in sort of the theoretical artifice that the diet is built on, and that's actually the case for most diets. I think a vegan diet can be perfectly healthy and it can be a good performance diet, but I don't buy theory, behind it. So, no, I think, the quote unquote paleo diet as it's practiced by most people now is only on the most superficial level at most, more like our ancestors than the way anyone else is eating. I mean, sure, okay, soda pop and stuff like that, but, all of the food, and this is pretty well accepted even by a lot of the smarter paleo eaters I know, all of the food that we eat today simply didn't exist 20 years ago. I mean, like the meat we eat is all, just, domesticated livestock and all that stuff. The vegetables have been, we've cultivated them and kind of to emphasize the qualities we like. I mean, if we could go back in time and find, a Paleolithic human and give him a choice between his diet and a modern one, he would jump all over a modern diet.
Yeah.
Because, we solved every problem, that's why we did it. That's why we changed our food, is because we saw problems that we wanted to solve. So anyway, to get back to it, I don't see a lot of legitimacy in the theory, and I really don't like people saying it's the one true way for everyone.
Right.
that's on my nerves. But in terms of just on the level of practice, it seems fine, precisely because human beings are able to adapt to all kinds of different diets. I mean, that's the mainstream nutrition science opinion, is that there is no perfect diet for people. There's a lot of flexibility. It's certainly not a case of anything goes at all. But you could have very kind of diverse ways of eating and thrive on any one of them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had Tim Noakes on the show a few weeks ago, and he's gone on this sort of semi-paleo style diet that includes like 60 to 70% fat, saturated. I don't know if it's all saturated, but a very high percentage of his diet is fat. And he says that it's the only way that he's ever eaten where he doesn't feel hungry is by eating things like whole milk, cream, butter, but then some salmon and grass-fed meats. And is there any evidence from what you've seen as a nutritionist that certain diets have more ability to satiate than others?
Oh yeah, I mean that's certainly the case. That yes, so, I mean, yeah, I mean I don't want to be too circumspect about what Tim told you, but I would suggest that if he went on an all broccoli diet, that would fill him up pretty well as well. Because calorie for calorie, it's pretty hard to eat 2,000 calories of broccoli. So you're going to get full on fewer calories, not with high fat foods, but actually with vegetables. But that said, there's a whole spectrum in terms of how satiating different types of foods are. I'm a big advocate of not losing the forest for the trees with nutrition. I don't even like to talk about nutrients. Sometimes you have to, but I'm kind of in the Michael Pollan camp, where it's just when you go from food to nutrients, you're really taking your eye off the ball. And I think people they get just too much into the weeds and the details and trying to sort of outthink everyone else in terms of what is the one true way for everyone to eat. And I prefer to keep my focus on just eat high quality food, and have some diversity. To me, it smacks of navel gazing a little bit when you kind of invent a diet, and really is that in 2013 are we just to invent a better diet? I don't think so.
Yeah, I would be really interested to hear about what kind of foods you eat on a daily basis, because sometimes people give recommendations, but it's a lot more interesting to hear what the person is actually eating.
Yeah, so I really do. I practice what I preach, and if you have seen books like Racing Weight, I kind of lay out guidelines in there and elsewhere, and it's really a focus on I think of certain like categories of foods, and I kind of just rank them from high to low quality, or just there's a group of high quality foods and a group of low quality foods. High quality foods are fruits, vegetables, nuts and seeds, whole grains, high quality meats and fish. Low quality foods would be refined grains, sweets, sort of fatty meats, and fried foods. So I try to really minimize the place of low quality foods in my diet and fill it up with high quality foods. But I really eat like a normal person. I'm not big on like superfoods or whatever. And I just think that you can eat like a normal red-blooded American, but just really pay attention to diet quality, and because there's something to be said for cultural foodways, like orange juice with breakfast, right? That's just something that it's part of our culture, and a lot of people want to get fancy and come up with like some kind of like pomegranate acai superfood drink. It's like, is there more in there? I don't think so. I actually think oranges are fruit, and they're a perfectly healthy food. So I have orange juice with my breakfast, and I think so. That's sort of the approach I take. Is breakfast for me would be usually most mornings cold cereal with fresh fruit and whole milk, and orange juice and black coffee. That's like, and there's nothing unusual about that at all, right? It's just, but I'm very picky with my cereal. You know, it's got to be all whole grains. It has to have fewer than 10 grams of sugar in it. You know, so again, like normal food, kind of a familiar way for people in our culture to eat, but just, you know, very high quality standards. And I'm certainly not having donuts. You know,
although the whole milk sounds a little bit unusual for some people. Is that, are you concerned about the fat at all?
No, I'm not. You know, I just, you know, I try to base everything I do on, solid research. And of course, you can find one study to support anything, but I try to go, you know, for sort of the mainstream consensus, not the fruits and flakes out there who are just, you know, going off the reservation, but, people like Marion Nestle, who wrote What to Eat, or Walter Willett at Harvard. You know, these people, they're kind of just like mainstream and just have not one study to back up what they recommend, but the most research. And so that's, you know, I try to have that sort of solid science foundation, and also real world stuff. You know, it's interesting. In my racing weight book, I have a collection of one-day food journals from 18 different professional endurance athletes, you know, runners, cyclists, triathletes. You know, I've got Shalane Flanagan in there, and Ryan Hall. All these people, I just contacted them and said, would you be willing to tell me everything you ate yesterday? And, you know, they all did. And very, very few of these people are on any kind of weird diet, or what I call a diet with a name. And I'm afraid that includes paleo. They just eat, again, they just eat like American people who have a real emphasis on quality. So getting back to the whole milk thing, you know, in the first edition of Racing Weight, you know, I kind of just went with what was out there, and I did recommend that people emphasize dairy products. But, you know, then some more research came to light which suggested that it really doesn't matter at all, and that in certain instances, whole milk and whole milk dairy products might actually be healthier. For example, like for young children and their brain and stuff. So, you know, I really try not to get too concerned about contradicting myself. You know, if I learn something new, I will just take back what I used to recommend before. And I try not to get too wedded to principles, you know, where, you know, in face of contravening facts. You know, if the facts change, you know, and I have to modify one of my principles, then I'll do that. And so that happened with whole milk for me. For a long time I used it, I recommended it, but now I've seen that it either doesn't matter or it's actually better to do the whole milk. So that's why I do.
Mm-hmm. How about lunch and dinner? What just basic what you call red-blooded American meals, or? Yeah,
well, so I'm fortunate. I'm not a big cook myself, but I married one, and you know, I work from home, so it works out so that often my lunch is often just dinner leftovers. You know, so I used to eat a lot of sandwiches, and before I gave them up, you know, they would be high quality sandwiches where it's, you know, whole grain bread, you know, some kind of lean protein source in them, and then kind of piled high with veggies, that type of thing. But now I'm more likely to have, you know, if my wife made like a chili, you know, the night before, some left over, I'll grab that out of the fridge. And that's because in one way it reduces variety because I'm having for lunch the same thing I had for, you know, dinner the night before, but it also increases variety because we sell the same thing for dinner, you know, more than 2 nights in a row, depending on how much we make. And whereas, you know, when I did the sandwich thing, it tended to be close to the same thing every day. And, you know, I don't know. I think it's just easier to get, you know, vegetables into a more dinner type of setup than a typical red-blooded American sandwich type of lunch. So that works out pretty well for me. Mm-hmm. You know, every now and then I'll, you know, I will eat I get canned soups. So like the Amy's brand of soups, I'll just, you know, crank open a can of that. Maybe have a salad with it. And then, yeah, so dinner, it's pretty much whatever my makes. She likes meat. So, you know, we will seldom have anything that's sort of a meat-free dinner, although we probably do more fish than meat. We get a lot of our fish frozen from Costco or whatever. It's perfectly good stuff. As long as it's not like the fried battered cod or whatever, which we would avoid.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, you couldn't give any real name to my diet other than that just standard culturally American type of thing. But again, you won't find much fried food, much refined grains, much sweets, and much like fatty or low quality meats in my diet. I avoid those what I consider low quality food categories.
Okay. We're coming up on time here, and I'm interested in your writing is very infectious and entertaining, and it keeps you interested. And how do you develop this curiosity, or are there certain people who inspire you to keep learning about running?
Yeah, it's funny. The thing that hooked me on running more than anything else, even when I was 11 years old, was the kind of the intellectual and spiritual side of it, where you can learn and explore. It just begins with figuring out how to get better or seeing yourself get better. That whole game of inputs and outputs. If I do this, what will the effect be? That I just found that endlessly fascinating. That I could make decisions about what to do with my running, and I could see the effect. A day, a week, a month, or a year later, and that's never changed. I just never stop learning and discovering, by actually running, but also, by talking to other people about it, by reading about it, which is great because, I'm 41 now, so I'm sure I've set my last PR, so the whole, improvement was a big motivator for me for a long time, but you can only keep improving for so long. But the discovery never stops. As long as you keep yourself out there, you're going to keep learning and discovering, which is great, because that can last a lifetime. And I don't plan to quit anytime soon. And in terms of the folks who inspire me, it can come from anywhere. I do sort of go looking for it. If I have a chance to talk to, I met Joe V. Hill for the first time recently at a conference, legendary running coach. And, it was just great to talk to him and learn from him a bit. And that's expected. When I meet someone like him, I expect to learn something. But it can also come from, completely unexpected sources as well, even things that just would appear to have nothing to do with running. So I just like to, I'm living the life I want to live, and it all goes into the soup somehow or another just by, just living the life I'm living. I keep learning stuff, and of course I have the advantage where my job is to communicate, to runners and other athletes. There's always something, a part of my brain is sort of looking for things that I can share with other people, which really helps me, remain alive to exploring and learning because I've got a job to do.
Matt, it's been great having you on the show, and you've given our listeners a lot to think about. Your books are really entertaining and really, really good reads, and I hope that people learned a lot, and thanks so much for taking the time to be here.
Yeah, thank you for your interest, and keep doing what you're doing. It's great.
Awesome. Take care.
All right, you too.
You've been listening to another episode of Paleo Runner Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please go to iTunes and leave a review. If you'd like to find out more information, go to paleorunner.org. You can send your feedback to Aaron@paleorunner.org. Thanks for listening.